This video is going to discuss the last of the financial efficiency ratios, something referred to as an asset turnover ratio. Now, the asset turnover ratio is simply equal to total revenue, now that comes from the income statement, divided by something called average total assets. Now, let me explain what this means. Average total assets is simply the idea of the beginning assets of the year and the ending assets of the year divided by 2. Now, I added a line in this spreadsheet that shows the average total assets for each year. This 1,649,000, that number is actually equal to total assets in this year plus total assets in the previous year divided by 2. Now, the reason Farm Financial Standards has suggested that we use average total assets is simply if the assets are different at the beginning and the ending of the year, then the question becomes which one should you use? Should you use the beginning of the year in calculations? Should you use the ending of the year in calculations? To solve that difference in opinion of which one to use, the Farm Financial Standards Council simply says the best way to do that is to add the beginning and the ending asset value and divide it by 2 and use something called average total assets. Okay. Now that concept will also become important when we talk about the profitability ratios. Okay, so average total revenue, the asset turnover ratio is simply equal to, and I'll put this average total asset number right here in the denominator, 1,649,180. So what goes in the numerator? Well, in the numerator is total revenue. Well, total revenue has to come from the income statement. Well, on the income statement, total revenue is $761,289. So that's $761,289. So when we solve that, let's go back to the balance sheet. We'll go to the asset turnover ratio, and what we'll do is we'll go equal to, and we'll go to the income statement. We'll get total revenue divided by, we'll come back to the balance sheet and get average total assets. And we would enter, we get 0.4616. Now let me change that right quick to a percentage. We'll take but a second here. We're going to change that to a percentage. Okay, now what does that number mean? Well, in any farm business, or any business for that matter, what you're doing is you're simply using assets to convert them into revenue. In other words, out there on the farm, you're using your land, you're using your machinery, you're using all the things that you have as assets on the farm to generate revenue. That's what the assets are for. So the asset turnover ratio is simply a way to kind of measure how rapidly those assets are converting themselves into revenue. Now that doesn't necessarily mean we're using up the asset. It's just what percent of those assets each year is actually total revenue. Now here's where students sometimes get confused. If 46.16% of the total asset value was in revenue, then how long would it actually take a business for it to generate revenue equal to the total assets? So what you could do, you could simply take 1 and divide it by 0.4616, and that's equal to 2.166. So what does that say? What that really says, now think about it, use your just good old common sense logic. What that says is if 46% of the total assets is in revenue in 1 year, when you take 1 and divide by that 0.46, it would take 2.166 years for the assets to completely regenerate themselves in terms of revenue. In other words, it would take 2.16 years for that $1.6 million in assets to generate $1.6 million in revenue. That's a really useful number. It's a little bit confusing to beginning students, the asset turnover, but it's a really an interesting number because if that asset turnover turns out to be a very small fraction, then the number of years turns out to be really large. It simply means that the assets are generating revenue at a very slow rate. However, if you had a very high percentage for the asset turnover ratio, your number of years would be calculated would be fairly small, which means the assets are generating revenue fairly quickly. In agriculture, think about that for a second. If you had a farmer, a rancher, who owned a lot of land, when the land has quite a high value, and a lot of machinery with quite a high value, you might get an asset turnover ratio that's fairly small. In other words, it would take several years for those assets to generate revenue equal to the assets. But if you took a very similar farm and that second farmer did not own the land, in other words, he leased the land, he would have a much lower asset value. Now, if he generated the same amount of revenue as the first farmer, he'd get a much higher asset turnover ratio, which would lead to a lot lower years in terms of how long it takes those assets to generate revenue. So the asset turnover ratio sometimes can give you a hint, I guess you would say, as to whether a farmer or rancher is using rented land or is using owned land. Now, that's not to imply that one's better than the other. It's just simply saying the asset turnover ratio can actually provide you clues about a farm or ranch total assets and the total revenue that they're generating.